The hammer was halfway down when Kestrel's lips crashed against Magnolia's, silencing the entire auction house in one breathless moment. Going once for 500, the auctioneer's gavel froze midair as gasps rippled through the crowd like wildfire through dry wheat. Magnolia's bound hands trembled against the wooden post, her indentured servant papers fluttering in the sudden hush that fell over Copperfield's monthly auction. She had been expecting another cruel master, another decade of back-breaking labor to pay her father's debts. She had not been expecting the mysterious cowboy in the back. Rhoda leap onto the platform and claim her with a kiss that tasted of freedom. In danger. What in tarnation? Judge Cornelius sputtered, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he witnessed the unprecedented disruption. Kestrel pulled back just enough to whisper against her ear, his breath warm and urgent. Trust me. His calloused fingers worked quickly at the ropes binding her wrists, years of handling livestock making the knots yield to his touch. The crowd erupted. Chairs scraped against wooden floors as men in dusty boots and women in faded calico rose to their feet, some shouting in outrage, others in bewilderment. The wealthiest biddersmen, who had come specifically for the beautiful redhead, whose servitude they intended to exploit in ways that had nothing to do with honest labor, pushed forward with murderous expressions. 600, hollered Barnabas Grimm, the saloon owner whose establishments were notorious for the mysterious disappearances of their female workers. 7, countered Obadiah Flint, whose ranch hands whispered dark stories about the fate of servant girls who crossed his threshold. But Kestrel's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. $1,000. Cash. The silence that followed was so complete that Magnolia could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. $1,000 was more money than most folks in Copperfield saw in 5 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch or half the buildings on Main Street. From beneath his worn leather coat, Kestrel produced a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. He peeled off the notes with steady hands, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the judge's face. For the lady's papers. All of them, including the debt. Dodge. Cornelius's jaw worked like a fish gasping for water. Magnolia's indenture was for her. Father's gambling debt's $200, that had grown to $500 with interest and fees. But her full freedom, the cancellation of all contracts and obligations, would cost exactly what the stranger was offering. That is to say double quotes, the judge stammered. The money's good, Kestrel said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the room. He placed the bills on the auctioneer's podium with the reverence of a man laying flowers on a grave. Question is whether Copperfield's justice is for sale, or if it actually means something. The last rope fell away from Magnolia's wrists, and she stared at this man who had appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to pray. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, but his eyes. His eyes held depths she wanted to explore for the rest of her natural life. Magnolia's fingers found Kestrel's as the crowd's anger pressed against them like a living thing, all heat and violence and frustrated greed. You can't just. Grimm started forward, his meaty hands clenched into fists that had broken more than their share of bones. Can't what? Kestrel's voice carried the quiet promise of a man who'd faced down stampeding cattle and hungry wolves. His free hand rested casually on the pearl handle of the Colt at his hip. Can't pay honest money for honest goods? Seems to me that's how auctions work. Judge Cornelius clutched the $1,000 like a lifeline. But his eyes darted nervously between Kestrel and the increasingly hostile crowd. Half the men present had been counting on acquiring Magnolia for purposes that would have made the devil himself blush. The other half were simply outraged that an outsider had waltzed in and upset their careful social order. The bidding wasn't closed, Flint growled, his hand moving toward his gun. I say we continue. The bidding's closed. When I say it's closed, the judge snapped, finding his spine at last. The money in his hands represented 6 months of his salary, and his wife had been after him for years to fix the roof on their house. Sold to the gentleman in the ... He squinted at Kestrel. What's your name, son? Kestrel Wild, he tucked. Magnolia behind him, as several men began pushing through the crowd, their intentions written in the murderous set of their shoulders. and we'll be taking our leave now. Not so fast. But a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through butter. Everyone turned to see a woman in an elegant green traveling dress standing in the doorway. Her silver hair pinned beneath a feathered hat that probably cost more than most people's monthly wages. I'm Cordelia Ashworth, and I have some questions. About this transaction, Magnolia's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She knew that name, had heard it whispered in the same breath as stories about missing girls and unexplained wealth. Cordelia Ashworth owned half the territory's mining claims and all of its most profitable ... enterprises. Enterprises that required a steady supply of young women who wouldn't be missed. Ma'am Kestrel touched the brim of his hat politely, but his body remained coiled like a spring ready to release. The transaction's complete. The judge has his money, and the lady has her freedom. Freedom. Cordelia tasted the word like wine that might have turned. What an interesting concept. Tell me, Mr. Wilde, what exactly do you plan to do with your purchase? The implication in her tone made Magnolia's skin crawl, but before she could speak, Kestrel's hand tightened on hers. Marry her, he said simply. The words hit the room like a lightning strike. Magnolia's head snapped toward him, her green eyes wide with shock. But Kestrel kept his gaze fixed on Cordelia Ashworth's calculating face. Ah, how romantic. Cordelia purred, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. A whirlwind courtship. So I have to wonder, what's a cowboy doing with $1,000 in cash? That's rather a lot of money for a man who works with cattle. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, in a territory where rustlers and bank robbers were hanged from the nearest tree. Accusations about the source of a man's wealth were tantamount to signing his death warrant. I work hard for my money, Kestrel replied evenly. Same as any honest man? Of course you do. Cordelia's eyes glittered with malice. Sheriff Hawthorne, perhaps you'd like to verify Mr. Wilde's employment history. Sheriff Hawthorne stepped out of the crowd like a reluctant actor taking the stage, his badge catching the lamplight as he moved. Magnolia could see the conflict written in the deep lines around his eyes. A lawman caught between justice and the political realities of a town where Cordelia Ashworth's word carried more weight than his badge.
Now, Mrs. Ashworth, the sheriff
said carefully, I don't see any cause to, don't you? Her voice cut through his protest like winter wind through thin cotton. A stranger appears in our peaceful community with more cash than our bank holds, disrupts a legal proceeding, and claims to be a simple cowhand? Sheriff, I'd say that warrants some investigation. Kestrel's thumb traced across Magnolia's knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her heart skip despite the danger pressing in around them. She could feel the tension in his body, coiled and ready. But his face remained impassive as carved stone. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, he said, his voice carrying just enough steel to remind everyone present that he wasn't defenseless. But the last I heard, paying cash wasn't a crime in these parts. Paying with stolen money is? Cordelia's accusation landed like a physical blow. The crowd stirred, murmurs of agreement rippling through the men who'd been denied their prize. Magnolia saw hands drift toward gun handles, saw the calculation in their eyes as they weighed the odds of taking what they wanted by force. But then Judge Cornelius cleared his throat, the sound somehow carrying more authority than all the posturing. Around him, Mrs. Ashworth, he said formally, do you have evidence that this money was stolen? Because if not, I'm afraid you're making some serious accusations without proof. For a moment, something flickered behind Cordelia's polished facade surprise, that anyone would dare challenge her, perhaps her frustration that her usual methods weren't working. But she recovered quickly, her smile never wavering. Of course, Judge, I wouldn't dream of making unfounded accusations. I merely suggest that Sheriff Hawthorne verify Mr. Wilde's story before we allow him to ... with his purchase. Ain't nobody's purchase, Magnolia said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. It was the first time she'd spoken since Kestrel's lips had silenced the auction, and the words rang with a dignity that made several men shift. Uncomfortably. My debt's been paid, fair and square. That makes me a free woman. Free to make your own choices, Kestrel agreed, his eyes meeting hers. And in that look, she saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not just desire, though that was certainly there, but respect, recognition. As if he saw not just a woman to be rescued, but an equal to be partnered with. Sheriff Hawthorne sighed heavily, the sound of a man who'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Wilde, I'm going to need you to come with me, just to answer a few questions, nothing more." And the lady, free to go, as she said. Hawthorne's eyes met Magnolia's with something that might have been apology, though I'd suggest she find somewhere safe to spend the night. Feelings are running high, and ... He didn't need to finish. Everyone in the room understood that a newly freed woman with no family or connections was vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with the law. "She'll be staying at the Rosewood Inn," Cordelia said smoothly. "As my guest, I insist." The words were phrased as generosity, but Magnolia heard the trap beneath them. The Rosewood Inn was Cordelia's establishment, and guests who checked in under her patronage had a way of extending their stays indefinitely. "That's kind of you," Magnolia replied carefully. "But I wouldn't want to impose, I insist," Cordelia repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the steel beneath the silk. Kestrel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Actually, Sheriff, if you're taking me in for questioning, I'd like to request that Miss ... He looked at Magnolia questioningly. "Sage," she supplied, giving him her real name for the first time. "Magnolia Sage. I'd like to request that Miss Sage be placed in protective custody until this matter is resolved. For her safety."
It was a
brilliant move, Magnolia realized. Protective custody would keep her away from Cordelia, while technically keeping her under the law's protection, rather than Kestrel's. "Sheriff." Hawthorne's weathered face creased into something that might have been relief or admiration. "That's actually not a bad idea, Miss Sage. Would you consent to staying in the jail's back room until we sort this out? It's got a proper bed and a lock that works from the inside." "I would..." Magnolia lifted her chin, meeting Cordelia's furious gaze without flinching. "Thank you, Sheriff." The look that passed between Cordelia and Hawthorne could have frozen the desert in July. Everyone present understood that they'd just witnessed a carefully orchestrated power play, and that somehow the mysterious cowboy and the newly freed woman had managed to outmaneuver the territory's most dangerous woman. "How disappointing," Cordelia said softly, her voice carrying the promise of retribution. "I do so hate to see hospitality refused," but Judge Cornelius was already gathering his papers, clearly eager to end the proceedings before violence could erupt in his courtroom. "The auction is concluded," he announced formally. "All debts have been settled, all contracts fulfilled. Good evening, everyone." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, like vultures driven from a carcass they weren't finished picking clean. Grim and Flint exchanged meaningful looks with several other men, and Magnolia didn't need a crystal ball to know they'd be waiting somewhere in the shadows, hoping for another chance at her. But it was Cordelia's parting words that chilled her. "Blood." "Enjoy your freedom, dear," the woman said as she swept past, her silk skirts rustling like a snake in dry grass. "I do hope it lasts longer than most people's luck in this territory." 20 minutes later, Magnolia found herself in the most luxurious jail cell she'd ever imagined. The back room of Sheriff Hawthorne's office was clearly designed for important prisoners or guests who needed protection. The bed had clean sheets, there was a washstand with fresh water, and the single window offered a view of Main Street rather than the alley behind the building through the thin walls. She could hear Kestrel's voice in the main office, calm and steady as he answered the sheriff's questions. She strained to make out words, but could only catch fragments. ... Worked the Broken Arrow Ranch for 3 years. ... Saved every penny. ... And ... had to act fast when I saw what they meant. To do with her? That last phrase made her heart flutter in ways she didn't entirely understand. He'd seen her on that auction block scene, the hungry looks in the bidder's eyes. Understood the fate that awaited her hand. He'd acted, not just with his money, but with his body, placing himself between her and danger without a thought for his own safety. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Sage? It's Sheriff Hawthorne. May I come in, of course?" The door opened to reveal the lawman carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like fresh bread. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of Kestrel, still seated at the sheriff's desk, his hat resting on his knee and his expression patient. "Thought you might be hungry," Hawthorne said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "It's been a long evening, thank you." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her chest. "Sheriff, is Mr. Wilde in trouble?" Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. "Far as I can tell, he's exactly what he claims to be. Worked the Broken Arrow for Jasper McMurray until the old man died last month. Jasper left him $1,000 in his will payment for 3 years of loyal service. I sent a telegram to verify it and got confirmation an hour ago." Relief flooded through her like cool water in the desert. "Then he's free to go? As soon as the paperwork's done?" The sheriff paused at the door. "Miss Sage, I don't know what your plans are, but I'd be real careful if I were you. Cordelia Ashworth doesn't like being crossed, and she's got a long memory." He left. Magnolia sat by the window and watched the street slowly empty as Copperfield settled into its evening rhythms. But her attention kept drifting to the sound of Kestrel's voice in the next room, steady and reassuring as mountain stone. Sun was painting the eastern mountains gold when Kestrel's voice finally called through her door. "Miss Sage, Sheriff says you're free to go." Magnolia had barely slept, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. She'd spent the night replaying every moment from the auction, the feel of his lips on hers, the protective strength of his body, the way he'd looked at her as if she were something precious rather than something to be used. When she opened the door, he was standing in the main office with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who'd wrestled with his own thoughts. All night, Sheriff Hawthorne was conspicuously absent, leaving them alone for the first time since their explosive meeting. "How are you feeling?" Kestrel asked quietly. Like my whole life just changed in the space of a heartbeat. The honesty in her words surprised them both. "I don't even know your first name. It's just Kestrel. My ma had a fondness for birds." His smile was small but genuine. "And I know this whole situation is ... unusual. I want you to know that you don't owe me anything. That money was mine to spend as I saw fit, and I chose to spend it on your freedom. What you do with that freedom is entirely up to you." The words were carefully chosen, respectful, but they carried an undercurrent that made her pulse quicken. He was giving her a choice, really giving it to her, not just offering the illusion of choice that most men presented to women in her position. "What would you like me to do with it?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, more revealing than she'd intended. His gray eyes searched her face as if memorizing every detail. "I'd like you to marry me," he said simply. "Not because you owe me, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because when I saw you on that platform, something in my chest caught fire, and I don't think it's ever going to burn out." The confession hung between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful and completely honest. Magnolia felt her breath catch in her throat. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough." His hand moved as if to touch her face, then stopped, hovering in the space between them. "I know you have courage. It takes spine to stand straight when the whole world's trying to break you. I know you have dignity. You didn't beg or plead when things looked darkest. And I know that when I kissed, you... double quotes." He swallowed hard. "When I kissed you, it felt like coming home to a place I'd been searching for my whole life." Magnolia's heart hammered against her ribs. In the space of 12 hours, this man had rescued her from a fate worse than death, protected her from Cordelia Ashworth's schemes, and now stood before her offering not just security, but partnership. Love, even if the heat in his eyes was anything to judge by. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," she said suddenly. "Before my father's debts caught up with us. I can cook, clean, tend animals, work a garden, not afraid of hard work, and I'm not looking for a man to take care of me like I'm made of spun glass." "Good," Kestrel replied immediately. "It's 'cause I'm not looking for a decoration. I want a partner. Someone who can stand beside me when times get rough, and who won't run when the work gets hard." And if I said yes? The question came out barely above a whisper. "What then?" "Then we'd make a life together. I've got plans to buy land south of here, start a horse ranch. It's good country for plenty of water, grass that grows thick, and far enough from town that folks like Cordelia Ashworth won't be dropping by for social calls. The picture he painted made something deep in her chest ache with longing. A home of her own. Work that mattered. A man who looked at her like she was the answer to prayers he'd been too afraid to voice. But there was still the matter of practical reality. Kestrel, she said carefully, what happened yesterday? Cordelia isn't going to forget. She's going to make trouble for us. His expression hardened. Let her try. The wedding took place 3 days later in the tiny church at the edge of town, with only Sheriff Hawthorne and his wife as witnesses. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with nervous glances toward the windows, as if expecting Cordelia Ashworth's men to burst through the doors at any moment. Magnolia wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Hawthorne had loaned her, her red hair braided with wild flowers that Kestrel had picked that morning. He stood beside her in his best shirt and cleanest pants, his hands steady as he slipped a plain gold band onto her finger. With this ring I thee wed, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow made before God and man. When he kissed her, to seal their union, it was gentle and reverent, a promise of the passion that would come later when they were alone. But even as they signed the marriage certificate, Magnolia could feel eyes watching from the shadows. Cordelia's influence stretched through Copperfield like poison through a well, and their defiance had made them targets. We should leave town today, Kestrel murmured, as they walked back toward the sheriff's office to collect Magnolia's few possessions. I've got a wagon loaded and ready, and the land I want to buy is a hard day's ride south. Running? Magnolia asked. There's a difference. But as they turned the corner onto Main Street, they found their path blocked by 6 armed men led by Barnabas. Grim, the saloon owner's face was flushed with whiskey and rage, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Well, Grim drawled. If it isn't the happy couple, heard you two got hitched. Grim. Kestrel's voice was flat, emotionless. His hand moved casually to Magnolia's elbow, guiding her slightly behind him. Congratulations are appreciated, but we've got places to be. Oh, I don't think so. Grim's smile was all teeth and malice. See, Mrs. Ashworth's been thinking about your little transaction. She's decided there might have been some irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Sheriff Hawthorne's voice cut through the tension as he emerged from an alley behind Grim's men, his shotgun cradled in his arms. His wife stood beside him, her face pale but determined. Grim's confidence wavered slightly. Sheriff, didn't expect to see you here. Funny thing about being the law in a town, Hawthorne replied dryly. I tend to show up where there's trouble. Brewing. Now what's this about irregularities? Mrs. Ashworth has reason to believe the auction wasn't conducted properly, Grim said, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. She's calling for the results to be ... reviewed. The auction was legal and binding, Hawthorne stated firmly. Judge Cornelius has already filed all the paperwork. The matter is closed. But even as he spoke, more men were emerging from doorways and alleys, surrounding them in a loose circle. Magnolia counted at least a dozen, all armed. All wearing the hard expressions of men who'd been promised easy money for ugly work. Kestrel's body shifted almost imperceptibly, weight moving to the balls of his feet. Magnolia could feel the coiled tension in him, the predator calculating odds and angles. But even a man as skilled as her new husband couldn't fight a dozen armed opponents and protect her at the same time. This doesn't have to get ugly, Grim continued, his confidence returning as more reinforcements appeared. Just turn the woman over and we'll call it even. Over my dead body, Kestrel said quietly. That can be arranged, Grim replied. Standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Magnolia could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could smell the dust and sweat and gun oil that seemed to permeate every conflict in this harsh territory. Then a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Grim, you always were a fool. Everyone turned to see an elderly man in a black suit walking down Main Street, his silver-headed cane tapping against the wooden boardwalk. Judge Cornelius looked older than his years, but his eyes were sharp as winter stars as he surveyed the armed gathering. Judge Grim said nervously, "This doesn't concern you, doesn't it?" Cornelius stopped 10 feet away, close enough that his words carried clearly to every man present. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're attempting to overturn a legal decision of my court. And that, Mr. Grimm, most definitely concerns me. Judge Cornelius pulled a folded paper from his coat with the theatrical flourish of a man who'd spent decades commanding courtrooms. I have here a telegram from the territorial governor received this morning in response to certain ... inquiries I've been making about recent events in Copperfield. The paper crackled in the desert wind as he unfolded it, and Magnolia saw. Several of Grimm's men exchanged nervous glances. Whatever the judge was about to read, it wasn't good news for Cordelia Ashworth's faction. Judge Cornelius, he read in a voice that carried to every corner of the street. Investigation into territorial mining claims reveals irregularities in documentation filed by C. Ashworth Enterprises. Federal marshals en route to conduct full audit. Appreciate your cooperation in maintaining order until their arrival. Signed, Governor Hayes. The silence that followed was so complete that Magnolia could hear a dog barking 3 blocks away. Federal marshals, Hawthorne repeated with obvious satisfaction. Well, that does change things considerably. Grimm's face had gone pale beneath his perpetual sunburn. Judge, I don't see what mining claims have to do with, don't you, Cornelius? Refolded the telegram with deliberate precision, because I find it fascinating that Mrs. Ashworth's sudden interest in disrupting legally concluded. Business coincides so perfectly with the federal government's interest in her ... enterprises. 1. Of Grimm's men, a thin, nervous fellow with darting eyes, took a step backward. Then another. Within moments, half the assembled troublemakers had melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere, but Grimm himself stood his ground, his hand still hovering near his weapon. This doesn't change anything, he growled. The woman was promised too. The woman, Kestrel interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down charging bulls and hungry wolves, is my wife. And if you so much as look at her wrong, I'll kill you. The words weren't spoken as a threat or a boast, were delivered as simple fact, the way another man might observe that the sky was blue or water was wet, something in Kestrel's tone, the absolute certainty, the complete lack of doubt or hesitation made even Grimm take an involuntary step backward. This isn't over, Grimm muttered. But the fight had gone out of him. Yes, Judge Cornelius said firmly, it is. As the remaining troublemakers dispersed, the judge approached Kestrel and Magnolia with a smile that transformed his stern features. Congratulations on your marriage, he said warmly. And might I suggest that you take your honeymoon somewhere far from Copperfield? The territory is wide, and there are many places where a man and woman can build a life in peace. An hour later, Magnolia sat beside her husband on the seat of a sturdy wagon, watching Copperfield disappear behind a cloud of dust and distance. Their belongings were packed in the wagon bed, along with supplies for their new life. Tools, seed blankets, and a strongbox containing the deed to 200 acres of prime grazing land that Kestrel had purchased sight unseen. Any regrets? Kestrel asked as they crested a hill, and the last buildings of town vanished from view. Magnolia considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, she'd been a bound servant facing a lifetime of degradation and abuse. Now she was a free woman, married to a man who looked at her like she was the sunrise after the longest night of winter. Only one, she said finally. Kestrel's hands tightened on the reins. What's that? I regret that we waited 3 whole days to get married. She smiled at his surprised expression. I should have said yes the moment you kissed me in that auction house. His laughter rang across the empty prairie like church bells on a Sunday morning. Well, Mrs. Wilde, we've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. As the wagon rolled south, toward their new beginning, Magnolia leaned against her husband's shoulder and watched the endless sky stretch out before them. Behind them lay a town full of people who'd tried to reduce her to a commodity to be bought and sold. Ahead lay land that would know the touch of their hands. Children who would carry their names, a love that had begun with a desperate kiss and grown into something as enduring as the mountains. Themselves, when Kestrel's arm tightened around her waist and his lips brushed her temple, Magnolia knew that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for without even knowing it. A home that wasn't a place, but a person. A man who'd bought her freedom not to own her, but to love her. A future written in the language of shared dreams and whispered promises, and if somewhere behind them, Cordelia. Ashworth was discovering that federal marshals were very interested in her business practices, and that her carefully constructed empire was about to come crashing down around her ears. Well, that was just the cherry on top of an already perfect day. The sun was setting by the time they reached their new land. Painting the grassland gold and crimson, Kestrel helped Magnolia down from the wagon, and together they stood at the edge of their future, watching their first sunset as husband and wife paint the sky in shades of promise. "Home," Magnolia whispered. "Home," Kestrel agreed, and sealed the word with a kiss that tasted of freedom and forever.